Thank you very much, Insan. I think I prefer to sit down because otherwise you won't see me or see just my head. So I think at least this way, you can see probably more. So I'm really, really pleased to be here today and to be talking about the ERF's role. And I'm going to be talking about two particular areas, migration and informality. I don't want to repeat what Raghi has said, but I want actually to put this in a more personal sort of framework. Because when ERF was set up, at the time I was actually doing my PhD, and the ERF was so kind to invite me as a PhD student to come and present. And I've benefited quite a lot over the years. So I became a research associate, been promoted to a research fellow, and the bad news for ERF is that they can't get rid of me because now I am a lifetime research fellow. But having actually been through the whole process, when I look back at my career, I actually realize how indebted I am to the ERF. Because without the ERF, I wouldn't have been able to have data, which is the first bullet point. So having access to data has always been a challenge. When I was doing my PhD, and I've always been interested in migration, finding data was basically impossible. And I had to make very tough decisions, which is basically to decide to work on other countries outside the Middle East completely, or to actually stick in and try to actually use the data I can find and keep on working on the region. So for me, looking back, now I feel that the ERF has played such an important role in actually collecting the data and making the data available is actually a huge sort of benefit to all researchers. But I also know that the ERF has played a very important role in terms of funding research papers and research projects. So a few years ago, I actually was a PI for a research project on migration, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about later, because I'm really pleased about the papers which came out of that project. Finally, but not least, I think also the ERF has played such an important role in terms of training and building capacity. And here, I'm talking again about my personal journey, but also it's all about having people like Raghi and Insan and Javad, who's been mentoring me until I was able to stand on my feet and also start mentoring other people. And I think this is really what the ERF is about. It's about the community of researchers and the support and time and effort they put in addition to all the great things that the ERF management actually do. So having said all of that, what I would like to actually focus on now, unfortunately, I'm a very boring academic. For me, if I really want to, assess and evaluate quality, I have to think about high research quality. So at the end of the day, did the ERF actually manage to produce papers in the top journals? Did it actually manage to inform policy? Did it actually manage to advance the economic literature? I know that we're always keen and interested in knowing more about our region, and I think this is the first step. But, I think that we've not only managed to, address gaps in our knowledge about our region and what is happening in our region, but we've actually managed to do even more because we've advanced the economics literature, the international literature on a number of issues. And today I'm going to show you two examples, one on migration and one on informality. So how do we actually measure high quality research? For me, it's all about publications, unfortunately. So when I look at, the working papers, when I look at the sort of journals the papers which have either been sort of presented in the ERF conferences or funded by the ERF or was actually made because of the ERF data, I find that we've managed to publish in the top journals in economics. And obviously, we have a long list of working papers, but at the end of the day, right, the journals tell us that our peers think of what we are doing as actually worthwhile publishing and also reading, because, citations also matter. So let me move to a topic which is close to my heart. Migration, and my interest in migration goes back many years. And what I'm trying to do here is not to actually mention every single paper written on migration, right, supported by the ERF. But I'm going to highlight few things which we didn't know that we now know. And then I'm going to actually focus on one particular paper of mine and show you how the ELMPS, the Egyptian Labor Market Panel Survey, enabled me to do something which hasn't been done before in the migration literature. So, the first thing is, I don't need to tell you about how important migration is for our region. But there are a number of things which we actually did not know about the impact of immigration and remittances on the left behind. So to just give you a few examples, thinking about female labor supply, right? In the case of Egypt, for example, we have at least one paper, and now we have a sequence of papers where actually you're looking at, right, how the immigration of the male impact females. And one very important thing we find is that there is a huge difference between the impact in urban areas and that from rural areas as well, and especially when we're looking at unpaid family work and subsistence. So basically, a lot of the time when we are looking at the impact of immigration, we're focusing so much on remittances that we're forgetting that, if a male disappears from the household, somebody else needs to do that work. And therefore, this increases female labor force, or female subsistence work in particular, and family work as opposed to participation. The other important issue, which is an ongoing issue, is whether immigration and remittances actually impact investment in education. And it's not going to come to us, it's not going to be a surprise to anybody in this room that still in our region, there are gender gaps. We still have preference for educating boys compared to girls. And this is basically a number of papers, again, looking at Jordan and Syria and Egypt, they find that there is a difference. Lebanon does not have that sort of gender difference. The other important question in this sort of literature is, what is the impact of immigration and remittances on the left behind when it comes to wealth and inequality? And a very recent paper again shows that basically poor rural households benefit. They benefit from remittances, but they also benefit because their living standards increase. This whole issue about the effects of immigration and remittances on the left behind actually is an important one in the migration literature, but I would say it's probably standard things which a lot of people have been looking at. But what is new is the whole sort of issue regarding the impact of migration on norms and institutions. And this is a completely new strand, not only in our region, but in the migration literature in general. And we have actually contributed to this strand because of the ERF, who have funded a project on migration under, I think about 3 or 4 years ago. And we've managed to actually, come up with very interesting conclusions. So the first one is basically how immigration has a positive influence on different indicators of institutional quality. And this effect is particularly stronger for high-skilled. We also have, there is one particular paper which looks at the impact of return migration from Arab countries on fertility. And they find that, those migrants who go to Arab countries, they come back and they have more children, controlling for income and all the rest of the selection. Another paper, which is a new paper, it's a working paper, we actually use the Jordanian labor market data. And we look at the impact of having a returnee male in the household on female empowerment in terms of decision making, in terms of permission to leave the house, a whole load of outcomes. And we actually find, not surprisingly, that there are negative implications for those returnees coming from quote unquote more conservative countries. And I'm not going to define conservative in this case. There is a reference to the paper. Feel free to go and read it. The other area which I spent a lot of time on is actually looking at the impact of return migration. Looking at, whether return migrants become entrepreneurs. There are other people who have actually also looked at things like, whether those enterprises survive longer. The whole issue of whether returnees accumulate human capital. And this is really important because all what you hear, or what I used to hear in this region, is the whole problem regarding brain drain. When we look at the evidence, and this is, this sort of literature shows that actually there is more of a brain gain compared to a brain drain. Because individuals, right, once they migrate, they accumulate, right, new skills, they come back and they have a wage premium, and they come back and they move up the occupational ladder. So, I'm going to try to be more specific and look at a particular paper which basically is looking at the impact of return migration on wages. And the title of the paper is Selection, Selection, Selection. And basically what this paper does is trying to quantify the impact of temporary migration on wages. But to be able to do it properly, and this is what hasn't been done before in the literature, we have been able, using the Egyptian Labor Market Panel Survey, to control for who migrates, who returns, then who participates in the labor market, who participates as a wage worker. So controlling for every sort of selection you might think of. And this is really important because so far the whole migration literature basically looked at migration as if the decision to who migrates and who returns is only one decision as opposed to being a double decision. And the Egyptian Labor Market Panel Survey is so unique because it actually collects data on current migrants collected from those who are left behind. We have extensive information on return migrants, on employment histories. Obviously, all of those things have been repeated in the recent data sets. But at the time, and still is, right, this data set is so unique in terms of trying to quantify this impact. I know it's a little bit hot and we all are falling asleep, so I'm not going to bore you with sort of numbers, but I want to show you the impact of actually trying to control for those selections. So basically, when I'm comparing the wage of a returnee versus the wage of non-migrant, without controlling for anything, not even individual characteristics, right? Looking at the raw data, I find almost a 20% difference. Then we know that we need to control for individual characteristics, and then we need to control for what the other previous studies have controlled for, which is basically participation in the labor market and migration, but not distinguishing between who migrates and who returns. And not surprising, most of the literature finds that the wage premium is much higher when you're looking at returnees versus non-migrants. So there is a difference of about 27%. But the most important contribution of this paper is actually showing that once you control for all the corrections, once you control not only for who migrates, but who migrates and who returns, this premium is actually lower. And the idea here is not whether the premium is 14% or 27%. The most important thing is actually trying to show how all the previous literature did not control for something which actually is biasing the results. So the implications of this paper to the rest of the migration literature is very simple, is that you really need to control for double selection. How can it be done? Look at the ELMPS. very simple, right? If you actually include questions, right, about returnees and about current migrants, and let's try to do this systematically in censuses, right, in labor force surveys, in household surveys, we actually would understand much, much more about what is going on when it comes to migration. So I'm going to move on to informality, and this is another area I sometimes spend time working on. And the most important issue when it comes to informality is trying to define informality. And here I'm mentioning a paper by Iset Tencel and her co-author, where basically she tries to define informality in the Turkish labor market, and she looks at enterprise definition, which is less than 5, or the social security coverage. And she actually comes to the conclusion that social security coverage is a better definition for the Turkish labor market. What is the significance of this work? Is that actually that work, right, has been cited by the OECD Employment Outlook in 2015. So another issue we are interested to find out more about is basically what are the effects of informal employment. First, what are the effects on wages? Again, Iset Tencel and co-author has got a paper which actually shows, on Egypt in this case, that actually, if you look at the same individuals, there is a wage penalty if they worked in the informal sector compared to when they moved to a formal sector job. But obviously, and not surprisingly, this sort of penalty has been increasing over time, and it hurts more the better educated. The other important issue in the informality literature is basically whether people are stuck there or not. So is it the case that informality is a stepping stone or a dead end? And I have a paper which actually shows it's a stepping stone to highly educated male workers. For females, right, uneducated workers, it's a dead end. And this is really important, trying to actually understand the effects of employment. To take one example of the, again, as the impact of our work in this area, I chose a paper which Raghi and I have been working on and actually is under review. I presented that work about a year ago in a major conference, and the feedback we had was actually extremely positive. So basically, this paper asks a very simple question, and I'm choosing it because it's a paper which actually deals with a policy issue. So here is a paper which informs policy. So this paper looks at whether flexible labor regulations increase formalization. And there is a debate in the literature about, whether labor market regulations are good or are bad. What we're actually doing here is using the introduction of the 2003 labor law in Egypt to actually look at the impact of the regulation in terms of flexibility in the labor market. So, since I only have 2 minutes, let me tell you why, right, we were able to actually do this work. Because the ELMPS is so rich in providing retrospective data, histories about individuals, when they started working, and all the sort of, transitions and mobility from one job to another. But not only we know whether they have moved or not, we know the characteristics, so we know whether they had contracts or not. So what we actually find is, because of the law, the new labor law, that the probability of actually moving from having no contract to having a contract has increased. And this is very interesting and very important in this literature, because most of the previous literature actually do not or are not able to come up with a causal relationship, and we're able to do that. So, to sum up, the ERF has played such an important role and continue to do so. However, before I finish, looking ahead, I feel that there are actually 2 particular gaps. I feel still very disheartened to find out that we don't know enough about migration in our region. right? And I feel that the ERF has got a role to actually try to help in collecting data or having access to data about migration in the Gulf states. This is an area where if the ERF doesn't do anything about, the whole international community, not only us in the region, actually suffer. And the second area is basically about informality, but rather than looking at workers, right, and individuals actually having information about firm-level data. And this is really important for us to be able to understand more whether informal establishments graduate to become formal or not. And as you can guess, those are only 2 recommendations. I'm sure I could have come up with a list, but for me, those are the most urgent ones. Thank you very much.